on our live stream. I would wave to y'all, but I'm not there with you. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Chloe and Christine tonight. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. All right, there we go. Well, good evening, Chloe. Can we just give her a round of applause?
Yes.
It is so wonderful to be in conversation with you. So let's just start here. I know how rare it is for a book to sort of just magically come together, right? We sort of think sometimes that, you have this idea for a book and then somehow the words just magically appear on the page and next thing you know, you have a book, right?
Yeah.
And I know it's a much more intuitive process than that, right? And so I'm curious to know, if you get settled there. So I'm curious to know, how long was this book on your heart before it became this powerful?
It wasn't on before.
Now it is on.
Right.
It's okay.
Sorry, you hear me. There's a button on there. Turn it on right quick. Can you hear me now?
There we go. All right. So, how long was this book on your heart before it became this powerful collection that we have here today? I'm very curious about that.
Wow. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This book, Life I Swear, was this concept back in 2012, and it started as a conversation. My girlfriend and I, we lived in New York, and we had these what we call Life I Swear conversations, and we, Tuesday random night, weekday night, we talk about life and just the ways we were angry at it, the ways we were delighted by it, and we'd sip a tall glass of wine and we'd sit back and be like, girl, I swear. And that just became like a Life I Swear conversation. I actually started a blog called Life I Swear back in, I'd say 2013. And I remember my best writing comes when I'm in commute. And so I remember being on the New York City subway and just being so inspired by looking at the people on the subway train. And I've always been a lover of stories, but just wondering what stories lived in each of these people. And if you've ever been in New York, you know that there are people who have crazy eyes, there are people who are blink and just look. You just don't know what's in the inside. There are people who are alive. There are people who are confused or worried, and just like that. The mystery was intriguing to me, and that's when I really fell in love with storytelling, though I'd always been in love with stories. But that's when Life I Swear was birthed, and that was 7 years before I decided I'm going to make this a book.
So you started with a podcast, right?
Yes, I birthed the podcast before I birthed the book, but the book was my intention before the podcast was delivered.
Okay.
And, as I was collecting other essays for the book, I was just like, this is just too good. I think my biggest revelations is when I'm able to when someone else is actually able to put a mirror to me through conversation. And so I wanted to capture that in a podcast. It takes a click of a button to start a podcast, but it took some, it took a lot of work to make it from my drafts to what we have today. And that's how I met you.
It is how you met me.
It's through the podcast.
It is how you met me. It's so funny. I have a number of questions here. We'll get into our introduction as well. I want to start with the forward though, right? So Elaine wrote the forward. And I love that she gives readers sort of an insight into your friendship, right? This blossoming and developing of sisterhood, right? And there's something that Elaine says that is in divine alignment with what I think about storytelling, especially telling our stories. And that is the undeniable power in sharing our truths, right? And I feel like this is not only for ourselves, like obviously there's truth and power in owning our own stories, but also sometimes I think it's even more important for other people, right? And I say that because when I have an experience, whether it be joy, whether it be pain, whether it be lessons learned, right? After I heal from that, right? My story can essentially aid in someone else's healing, can aid in someone else being courageous, can aid in someone else's journey, and maybe even become a part of their story, right? And I just think that's so powerful. And I feel that's sort of the essence of your essay collection. Is that what you were sort of like hoping to drive home with like this storytelling? Like not only having it be cathartic for the women who wrote the stories, but also hoping that it would somehow inspire, motivate. There's something about stories being aspirational and inspirational, right? Was that sort of like the essence of this book?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think even in Elaine's forward, she articulates the start of our friendship better than I probably ever could, which was the day that I met Elaine, I was going through just immense heartbreak. And to the point where it was just like spilling out of me. And we were on our friend's bed and I was just telling her everything that happened. And she was listening quietly and just listening to my storytelling. I didn't know then that she was actually going through the same thing, the same exact thing. And so in me, we were just talking through, probably oversharing. But I knew instantly that she was someone I could trust in that way, with my heart. And by me sharing how I was processing, it helped her quietly also process. I would say the same thing to you. You probably didn't know this, but I met Christine it was about a year and a half ago where I interviewed her for the podcast. And she shared with me, and the podcast is about, decoupling and how to do that healthily. And then her question, it was like the existential question of the episode is, but why do we get married?
Yeah.
And at that time, I had gone through a separation and there was residue of heartbreak on the tail end of it, but I felt it deeply. But in you sharing your story, it had me asking myself, like, but why do we do all these things that we kind of go through the motions of doing? And to me, that's the point of the book, because we get so caught up in either expectations or perfectionism, and we don't actually ask ourselves why we were in motion, And so I wanted to lay intention with this book to let me be raw and honest with myself, and in that it will be inspiration for the other readers to do the same for themselves.
I think you definitely achieved that. And it's interesting because I know a lot of the women in this book. And even when you know people, you don't know their whole story. So there were essays and I was like, I can't believe it. But it's so powerful to think of all the things that we have overcome, right? All the things that we're going through simultaneously, especially right now, you know, in the midst of COVID, so many people, our lived experiences, our emotions, all of these things that we're going through are the same. And yeah, I found it to be very inspirational and aspirational for me, which I guess leads me to my next question, which is there are so many dynamic women. I don't know how you chose. How did you choose? How did you choose the essays for this collection?
It was, it kind of was like intuitive. I feel like a lot of these women I was led to, because a lot of these women, their experiences overlap in some way, some degree with my own. A lot, I mean, I'd say about a third of the women have been close friends. The others just required an ask. And I think that speaks to the power of intention, but also where we all are collectively. Like we're all in this space of wanting to give to our sisters, but also needing to recognize that while we've all been talking the self-care talk, a lot of us also haven't asked ourselves tough questions sometimes, and I can speak on behalf of myself, not been honest in therapy, you know, and this is to me an opportunity to like really just lay it out there. And knowing and trusting the intention of the book, that it is meant to be a gateway for others to be more vulnerable, but that work has to start with ourselves. And I think for myself, but also for a handful of the women who are in this book, where you were like, I didn't know that about them. They had never shared some of these things. And so I think it takes a bravery to do that, but I think the yes that I got from every woman was, it is the place that I'm at in my life is requiring me to actually do that hard work.
And I found too, I mean, if you ask, more than likely people will share their stories, right? Whether it's asking, how did you go about writing this book? Or something more personal like, how did you get through that divorce? So, you know, like, and I think there's so much power there. I love that you have women of different ages, right? I'm very big on this idea that we should have friends who are older than us and also friends who are younger than us, right? So when I was growing up, I kind of felt like I could only learn from people who were older than me, right? And that is just entirely not true. Plus young folks, I mean, y'all keep us beautiful, you know, keep us on our toes. So Life I Swear is divided into 3 parts. And part 1 is Sum of My Parts. Part 2 is Bear Witness. And part 3 is Piece It Together. So I kind of wanted to move through our conversation in that order. And you open the book exploring your identity, right? And I have to be honest, when I met Chloe, I mean, obviously I saw she was beautiful, but I just never thought about her genetic composition, I guess, around that, right? And so, like, I didn't even know your identity until I read this. And your beautiful mother is here. You can wave to the people, right? But I love that you did this deep dive into assimilation, right? Or as you say, this constant assimilation. And I feel it's something that Black people, I couldn't even just say Black people, I would say just like BIPOC communities in general, right? This need to feel like we're constantly assimilating, right? Whether it's a real or perceived need, right? Which is actually explored in one of the essays. One of the essayists, she says, being Black is only some of me. It is not the sum of me, right? Why did you feel it was important to open the book in this way, speaking about identity?
Yeah, so Sum of Me is the title of the part of the book. Sum, S-U-M, and I love playing with words.
I saw that, I like that a lot.
I love playing with words, but sum of me. I am the sum of me. I am, and that particular contributor, Eniake, says, brilliant poet and writer. From her lens, she writes that race was a burden. She is more than her race. And but I think just the collective of essays that live in the sum of my parts is really, I am from all of the things that make up who I am. I am from my race. I am from my origin. I am from my parents' stories. I am from my ancestors' healings and traumas and what they've passed down. I am from the memories. I'm from the heartbreaks. I am from every friend who has raised me, you know? And so when I think about identity, I wanted to be holistic in what that means. You know, yes, I wanted to zoom out because identity is really just our sense of self. Who do we see ourselves as? And what's our self-perception? Because I think that matters, and I think that also is the portal to how we live life and how we move through life. And so the progression of the book for me has to start there. Is how do you see yourself as? And sometimes we don't see ourselves in the most positive light. And taking that as kind of the baseline, how do we go and move and thrive from there? What work do we need to do? What questions do we need to ask us? And so the sum of my parts, it recognizes all of what we are, so that we can understand like deeply that is informing the decisions we make, the relationships we get into, the confidence and the boldness we have or we don't have to move through life. And so that's the sum of my parts.
Because some of our identities are sort of bestowed upon us
Yes.
at work, right? And we don't really explore that for ourselves, you know? I think that has been a very awakening moment for me, right? It's like, okay, so social identity that was placed on me may have been that I'm a black woman born in this place, right? But like, what does that mean to me? And also what parts of identity that are bestowed upon us that we don't want to take ownership of, right?
Yeah.
And so, I was curious about why you opened the book that way. But I can see how it informed.
I think it's important to take inventory of in the breadth and the spectrum and all the things that make up my identity. What am I choosing? What was assigned? What was I born into? You know, what is being thrust on me that actually feels suffocating?
You know, those identities have burdens, responsibilities, expectations, right? So, for example, if you are the firstborn girl or firstborn son in a family, there may be a weighted expectation on what you can and can't do, right? And we carry those things with us sometimes without even knowing. And like you said, they inform our decisions. And you look up and all of a sudden you're 35 and you're like, wait, why did I do that?
And you're living a life that is different than the one you envisioned for yourself when you were a girl, before society introduced you to all of these elements of identity that you then lived up to.
Is that what informed the subsection, that between worlds piece?
Between worlds. So I have an essay in this between worlds that lives under some of my parts. It sounds a little matrix, the table of contents, which you'll see it if you purchase the book. But Between Worlds is a collection of 5 essays of women from across the Black diaspora who articulate their experience living between worlds. And it could be, for me, my essay is titled Melted from Kin. It's really, I am literally the fusing of both sides of my family. But it's living between worlds. And for some of the essayists, that's an empowering thing, to be able to navigate and leverage their understanding of multiple worlds. And then for some of the essayists, it positions them in a place where they either have to choose between 2 sides, or so they thought. or had to just understand their role in certain dynamics and contexts based on being at the intersection of many different worlds.
So, while let me take a sip of water. My throat got dry, honestly. And then I'd love for you to read for us.
From that part.
Thank you so much. Whatever you decide, I won't put the pressure on and have you read one of my favorite ones.
Ooh, I don't even know what that is. This is hard. But I'm gonna choose the one that is in the essay called Hues of Exposure. And well, we already got the introduction that my mother is a white woman sitting here. So this is
If you have your book,
this is to that.
This is on page 23. If you have your book.
Yes. And I'm going to read at 24. And I grew up in Niger, sub-Saharan Africa, for context as I read this. While I was often mistaken for a native of Nigerian, on my own, walking alongside my mother with her freckled skin and green eyes, revealed that it wasn't my native land. It othered me. I was the daughter of an Anasara, a white person, and by default also considered one myself by many Nigerians, which was less about race than it was about privilege. The teasing children who tagged behind us at the flea market, and the elderly women who held their hands out for change at the stoplight would echo, Anasara, 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 in a chant. I remember walking through a rural market in Baleara one scorching hot afternoon with my mother, a regular day trip to collect beads, baskets, and woven blankets for her craft work that adorned our home in Niamey. We pushed through the thick crowd of vendors and merchants, and I tried to keep up with my mother's pace as we tailed behind another mother and daughter in front of us. When the child turned around, she burst into horrified tears at the sight of my mother. The child's mother explained that the girl had never seen an Arasara before in her life, and was naturally taken and shaken by her first sighting. As we continued through the market, my eyes caught gazes from vendors and shoppers in my direction. Those gazes, intentional or curious, questioned my affinity to my mother as much as to them, who were of my same complexion. That was the start of a years-long struggle to find balance in being uncomfortably pulled between African and American, kinship and foreigner, black and white, and privilege and poverty. My experience in Niger sat at an intersection of all of those things.
So beautiful. When I read that section, it made me think of my own journey home. And for anyone who is of the African diaspora who has never been to Africa, it can be, it's a very soul-stirring experience. And for me, obviously it was the opposite experience that you had, but what I saw were pieces of my friends. You know, I would see, you know, one of my friends, their nose. I would say, oh my gosh, that's so-and-so's eyes. I would, you know, and so it was this place that was home, right? And I would say, it's like having a home with no residence, and having a home with no address, right? And it was a very much awakening part of my identity and the way that I looked at being a Black person in America, being from the Caribbean, and seeing all of these bits and pieces and parts, and seeing how literally we were dispersed throughout the diaspora and seeing them all in one place. It's just such a powerful, you know, I guess I kind of felt like that little girl at the market, right? Just wanted to kind of burst into tears, right? The first time you have this realization And I just thought it was really beautiful that you shared that. Thank you for reading that for us. I want to move now to part 2.
Yeah.
Bear witness. So for me, this section is my favorite. I know you're not supposed to have favorites. This is my favorite. It's super powerful, partly because there's so much emphasis placed on acknowledgement and forgiveness, which are essential parts of our healing, right? You cannot heal without acknowledgement and forgiveness. And these essays were so personal, so personal. Even your essay, Here's Imagined, right? Which I'm totally going to ask you to read from, so you might as well just turn to that. Can you share what you envisioned for this part of the collection?
Yeah, so this part is called Bear Witness, and again, the matrix. Still I Rise, which is around, it is the living stories of the poem, right, by Maya Angelou. But Still I Rise, it is, I have been through hell and high water, and still I rise. And all the things that you thought I wouldn't survive, still I rise. And so the stories that live in this section of that part, are about trauma. But I think more importantly than being about trauma, they're around post-traumatic growth. How are we taking what we've been through, and rather than that being the reason that we don't thrive, being a deterrent to our growth, that is why we are growing. And the second part is the current of adieu, which is goodbye. And it is essentially around heartbreak. And when our hearts are broken, either through loss that we experience or goodbyes that we have to do for our own well-being, it is how we are kind of moving through our goodbyes. And goodbye, the current of adieu, because the current, when we are saying goodbye, it is up and down. It is a current, it is a wave. There is nothing consistent about saying goodbye when it comes to the heart. We can be in one place where we know that it is real, and we are trying to wrap our mind around it and be pragmatic about a goodbye. And then with the way the heart works, we get into these lows. And so to me, the bear witness, it is like, look at my flow. As the current is pulling me down, I'm still coming up.
I love how you start this. So I'll read. So you can take a sip of water before I tell you read your next piece. But Chloe starts this section with Still I Rise, which it says, sometimes it's easier to operate from the wounds of our experiences than to conjure up the faith that there is more beauty to this life than the past might suggest. We owe it to ourselves to give our stories a chance to be free from the chains that hold them captive from healing. It takes some time to redefine what we think those wounds say about the woman we are. Despite the trauma, despite how we felt about ourselves yesterday, and despite sometimes feeling bound to our past, how do we rewrite our personal story as one of resilience and reframe our interpretation of it while still coping with the breadcrumbs it leaves behind? So beautiful. So beautiful. And I think for me, this was the most powerful section because I know how difficult it must have been for these women to not only acknowledge and possibly even relive some of this trauma, right? But to share it, to show what healing looks like, as you said, in waves, right? I remember one of the essayists saying, now that I am an adult, I am still, right? Which this is like such a part of our stories, right? And I just love that so much. Was it healing for you to share your own piece in here? What was that like for you?
Yeah.
I told her to take some water.
Yeah, it was absolutely healing. And, you know, when I wrote this book, I wrote my essays between January and March of 2020. I like made it just like my full-time job. But I wrote it because I was in a heavy place in my life at the time. But I also wrote it, just was committed to writing my essays in general, but particularly the essays that live in that part, because I also recognized that there were things from my past that I had put on the shelf, let collect dust, and hope that no one would ask me to take it down from the shelf and dust it off and actually like polish it, right? And so this was like having to take the things from the dusty shelf and like really polish it, and look at it, and see what lies under the dust. And it was definitely hard. It was in the way that I hadn't been honest with even my therapist. It was a requirement for me to be honest in these essays, and it was the only way to get through the stories. Yeah. You know, I mean, too long had gone around it, and if I don't talk about it, it's not going to be brought up, and it won't. Yeah. Then it didn't happen if no one heard the tree fall. Yeah. But you know, the honesty with ourselves is the only way that we can really get to the other side of it. Otherwise, we go through these cycles. You know, we go through these cycles of wondering why we're unable to, you know, find the right intimacy with friendships or partners, or why we keep getting in our own way, or why, you know, we keep running into the same kind of challenges. And so the only way to address that is to address our past and know that once we do, it's really a gateway to something better on the other side. So it was hard, but I just made it a commitment to do. It was only
about that on the podcast. I remember telling you how I had to own up and sort of acknowledge how I ended up in my marriage, right? And like being super honest about that, and getting to the root cause of it. Because I think, you know, you skirt like, oh, in my 30s, of course I want to be married. It's a little deeper than that, you know, go a little deeper, right? Oh, I'm a single mom, I'm tired, I want help, right? Like, and like really getting to it and having to own up and say like, wow, you know, I didn't know my partner. I was looking for a good guy to help me raise my daughter. That's exactly what I got, right? Like, but I wasn't looking for it, like, in really owning that. Yeah. And you know, I joke sometimes. I say sometimes me and Joe got married to help save other marriages or help other relationships, right? Because again, that's the power of telling our stories, right? And I remember you listened to that podcast. I did. Yeah, he was really proud of us. Yes. Us, right? Because it's a very he's proud of us too. But you know, I think there are certain times, I think especially when it comes to womanhood, that are very difficult to talk about and be honest about, right? And so yes, he is proud of us, and I am proud of you. I want you to share whatever you feel comfortable sharing and reading from this section, but I think it's so powerful when we hear authors read their stories and what they choose to highlight and share. For anyone who is curious just about the healing process, who may be fearful of sort of tackling some of the things that are challenging them, part 2 of this book will be very, very inspiring and motivating for you. So I'm not saying start there, but I'm just saying you will probably linger here a little bit longer.
It's so funny because for those who came to my friends and family for that, my friend Shakira moderated it. And a couple days before the event, she gave me a bunch of questions that she was planning to ask. And one of them was about this essay called Unhealed Wounds. And I was like, why are you gonna ask me that? Like, can you not ask me that? This event can be super easy, breezy, comfortable. And then she was like, no, we're gonna get to all the questions. We're not, because I had asked her, do you want me to narrow down the list? Like, I can do that for you. And I was gonna definitely scratch that one. And she was like, no, we'll get to all the questions. We'll have time. But then I was also like, but that's what this book is for. So, you know, that is, I have to say yes to it. So in that vein, I'm going to choose an essay from that essay. It is called, I'm going to choose an excerpt from that essay. It's called Unhealed Wounds. It is about a relationship I was once in. It lasted 5 years. And every bit of it was, it's interesting. It was not a healthy relationship. And I was on the brink of saying every bit of it was not divinely aligned, but of course it was. Of course it was. And I think my resolve coming off of that relationship and relationships that were different variations of the toxicity relationship gave me were aligned, because that is how testimonies are born. And so I will, and it is called Unhealed Wounds because we both had them. We both had unhealed wounds. And we, you know, when we talk about toxic relationships and women might been emotionally or physically or in other ways abused, we don't talk about how the person who they were with also has unhealed wounds, right? And so I wanted to call that out without pointing fingers. It's just an acknowledgement that we are all navigating life with unhealed wounds, and we can take them out on ourselves, which is something I was doing during this relationship, or we can take them out on other people, which I think this was an example of that. Give me 2 seconds.
We'll give her 2 seconds while we think about, I think, just our own unhealed wounds, right? And I know for me, you know, it manifests and shows up in so many different ways. But it's only, again, in that acknowledgement and forgiveness piece. I think so often we think about forgiving others, but we don't really think about forgiving ourselves. And so I think that's another reason why this part of the book is so powerful for me, seeing these women go through this full cycle to address this trauma, which is acknowledgement, forgiveness, and then healing, right? So just as important as it is to forgive others, we also have to forgive ourselves. A lot of our unhealed wounds, much like our identities, are cast on us, put on us, right? We carry a lot of generational trauma, a lot of generational healing and things that need to happen. And for me, that's been, I think, very helpful in addressing and acknowledging and forgiving, knowing that, yes, I may have made some choices, right? But then there's also some things that inform those choices that I didn't necessarily choose, right? We don't choose our parents. We don't choose, how we were raised and, some of the experiences that we have. And so understanding just that totality, I think, of trauma and healing, right?
Yeah. So I'm gonna read the first 3 paragraphs and then the last paragraph. So, his name was Guy. You could call it love, but it was codependency and control masqueraded as love. My naivete paid the price. He was 16 years my senior, with a physique that commanded and a gaze that wouldn't let loose. We met at Howard Homecoming, amid the rhythmic waves of dancing to blaring reggaeton beats. I fell in infatuation with Guy, because he was everything I was not, assured, with a presence that either repelled you or lured you in, and made you want to be on his team. For me, it was the latter. His eyes and scars told stories, and I was intrigued by them. He had anecdotes for every street corner in the city. His past was entangled with tales of money, drugs, violence, and prison. Riding alongside him as we drove through DC, I'd sit and listen to his accounts of a life of crime and punishment, looking out the window at the battered world that was once his. He was a changed man, he swore. It resonated, and I was impressionable. I understood what it meant to want to disentangle yourself from your past, to reinvent a new narrative, because I wanted the same. I was attracted to our differences and inspired by the idea that we could heal each other's wounds. In many ways, we were growing up together. We quickly became interwoven into each other's lives. I was eager to love, and his attention convinced me I was getting it in return. Fresh out of college, the relationship thrust me into adulthood before I had a chance to know who I was and what I deserved. He soon became my chosen family, a father figure, best friend, and lover all in one, who filled voids I unknowingly had. The more I invested, the more I hoped for a reward that the relationship couldn't actually provide, because he had wounds of his own that toxified us before we even rooted. Move to the end. It took me years to recover from that day and that relationship. The entanglement of codependency and abuse created a compromising relationship with myself. The trauma I carried with me from it lay dormant until more of my whole self was needed to nurture the prospects of new budding relationships and friendships. I hadn't recognized it as trauma until escapism and distrust became patterns that distracted me from sitting deeply with the impact the shame had on my esteem. I needed to name my trauma and bring meaning to it in order to recognize my own self-worth. I needed to see past the parts of my story that I wasn't proud of in order to make amends with the young woman that environment fostered. I needed to forgive myself for being a product of my insecurities and of the longing for love I once had. I needed to wrap myself around she who was once shattered until my own warmth mended my wounds.
Beautiful. You feel writing that, right?
Yeah.
You had to have been just so freeing, right? To write that and reflect and then see yourself on the other side, right? Because I know in the midst of those moments, sometimes we're like, I am never going to get through this. How am I going to survive this? How am I? And to see, you know, we talk a little bit about resiliency in here, right? And I have to imagine that when you wrote that, you saw your strength and resiliency, right? And when you really may not have seen it in that moment, but you were able to see it upon reflection.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the beauty in putting our stories to rest on paper, and you can publish them to the world, or you can burn them on a, you know, in a bonfire, however you release. You know, your stories don't own you anymore. It doesn't own me, and neither does the narrative that accompanied that story. Neither does the outside perception and how they interpret that story. It doesn't own you anymore. You are in control, and if you want to burn it, if you want to frame it, If you want to share it, you have the autonomy to do that. And so for me, while in that relationship, I felt completely out of control. Being able to write it from my perspective, and there are many truths that exist. That I write this book knowing that the person who this particular essay is about has his own truth. That is for him to deal with. But for me, this is my truth. This is my lens because I see the world in my way. And no one can take that from me, and so that control. And it's interesting. As a Virgo, you're like, you're always trying to get control. I'm also but I'm also releasing. Yeah. And that release is how I'm exercising control. Yeah. Because when it owns you, you don't, it is all consuming. By releasing it, and it is no longer my weight to carry, I don't have to overthink it. I did all my overthinking here. It's not my job anymore. And the release and letting go of control is my way of controlling it.
Yeah. And you no longer lead with that narrative, right? So that's what I would find when there were wounds that hadn't healed, you lead with that narrative, right?
And you make decisions. You do. Leading with that narrative. You do. You make trauma-informed decisions. And now that you release it, you make joy-informed decisions, right? Yeah. And so that is my ROI on this book.
Beautiful. Yeah, it makes me think of your first book is wonderful and a success. It makes me think of my second unfinished novel, which I've, given it my all, given the publisher exactly what they wanted. It wasn't necessarily the story that I wanted to tell, but I led with that unfinished novel. The minutes of, oh my gosh, you're a writer, that would be this, it didn't matter what I had done before, what I was working on. And I had gone to a writing workshop one day, and everyone's going around the room telling who they are, what they're working on. And I introduced myself as Christine, and I went to launch into that narrative. I don't know if you know the author Marita Golden. She's an older Black woman, and if you know, those of you who know her, you can totally imagine her doing this. So here I am, woe is me. She stopped me, she was like, I feel like I have just heard this before. She was like, can you just stop telling that story? And I was like, right? But that's what happens, right? When those stories still own you, right? Yeah. Oh, this failed novel, woe is me. And she was like, just stop. Yeah. Just stop. And it was the awakening and call out moment that I knew that only a Black auntie could give me. Yeah. But that's what it makes me think of when we allow these stories to own us. They literally become what we lead with, what we choose with, what we don't even think to lead, right? With the wonder and the beauty and the joy and the Yeah. And so I love that you released that. I love that you shared that. As you said, it is your truth, and I love that you said there are many truths because that is so accurate, right? But owning your truth and having your story and not burning it. Thank you for not burning it and sharing it with us. There is such power in that. And I think that's the perfect segue to part 3 of this book, which is Piece It Together. And Chloe with her play on words. Peace as in serenity, but also peace as in the pieces of us, the pieces of who we are. And for me, this section, it spoke to one of my favorite sayings, my personal mantra, and I know I've shared this with you, and that is, I'm not a grown woman. I am a growing woman. And may I always be grown and never fully grown, right? And, this section reminded me of this that there are so many pieces and parts of us that we are just
Mhm.
always pulling together that are collectively making our story, right? And this is the aspect of growing,
Yeah.
right? These pieces of us help us grow, right? And for me, this idea of being grown, I think it puts such a unnecessary burden on us, right? Being grown means I can't make any mistakes, I can't do this, I can't do that, I should know better, I'm grown, and I would find myself, why did you do that, you grown,
Yeah.
It's like, no, I'm grown,
Yeah.
I'm learning, I'm experiencing, right? And may I always be doing that,
Yes.
right? So, I'm curious, since we are always in this process, right? These pieces and parts of us, what does this section represent for you?
Yeah.
What does it mean
In
piecing together?
Piecing together, it is, the sum of my parts, because I am made of many things. Some of them might feel fragmented, in my early years of learning myself. But when I bring all those pieces together, I find peace. When I bring all of those pieces together, I'm not fragmented, I'm whole. And there's a holiness that comes from when we see ourselves and we center ourselves in ourselves. And the piece it together is with all of the wisdom I've collected in my life, despite the trials they may have gone through to get to that place of wisdom, I can trust myself. And that's the self-trust in the title, is I can sink into what I know for sure, while also being in awe and fascinated and excited about what I don't know.
Yeah.
Because the commitment to ourselves to self-examine, to analyze ourselves, that is a discovery. We are explorers of ourselves and our lives that we are navigating. And in the spirit of that, I don't want to stop discovering myself and what I'm capable of and what I can do, but that I have to root in self-trust, because otherwise I'll be questioning along the way.
Yeah.
But I have to know that the genesis of my growth is right here, and I don't need to. I think, when we think about the ebbs and flows of life and where our biggest moments of confusion were, or longing were for belonging, which is a lot of my story, it is in seeking that validation from external forces. But when we root ourselves in our hearts, in our bodies, then we know that we can trust the instinct that our body is telling us, We know when we're uncomfortable. We know when we are at ease. And for me, that is self-trust. And that means that the journey where I was looking, like I was looking around, just like couldn't make eye contact with, but now it's like my path. I think of alignment in terms of like literally alignment. Like there's God, there's head, there is spirit, there's heart, there is my feet. And let me walk. And so it's trusting that and trusting how all of these pieces come together, make this alignment, like centralized in me.
I call that divine alignment. And we all know that feeling when you're in divine alignment, right? It just feels right, right? I love that you're learning to trust yourself in that way. It definitely came for me later in life, right? I will say it definitely gets easier as you get older. But, I love that you are, sharing this, allowing other women to share their stories as well. It was so interesting for me to see bits and pieces of my own life and own narrative and other people's stories. And I guess in closing, can you believe an hour went by that fast? in closing, what would you want readers to take away from this book?
It's so interesting. When different questions are asked of me, I have to turn to the front or to the back. When I turn to the front, I see myself. When I turn to the back, I see other women. Or I have to turn to the table, like I have to, like, this is my channel.
Rooting.
And so I'm channeling other women, you know, and for me, the takeaway is I think it's so important to remember that life is not linear. The idea of a linear life is unrealistic. It can be dehumanizing. It doesn't make space for those of us who either want to live creatively and magically and out of the box, or it doesn't make space for those of us who are in marginalized communities where that's just not the way life is set up. You know, success isn't down this like straight and narrow progression through life. And so I just want to, like, in all the diversity of stories and nuances and texture and layers that live in all of these women that are represented here but reflective of all of us, I want us to just lean into the idea of a non-linear path, whether it is the path to love or the path to healing or the path to God or the path to ourselves. It is not a straight and narrow. There is no limit. And as long as we lean into self-trust, then like just follow that, you know, and no one knows us better than ourselves. And in this day where we're like comparison, you know, is a thief of joy, but it's not realistic to compare because healing and stories and our own personal evolution are all within the framework of our context. You know, and all of us have different contexts. I love that word. I'm probably overusing it. Because your story is different than mine. I can't tell you what to do. And so the self-trust, the self-healing is so important because we are all we got. And I want us to like center our stories. It is an opportunity to be the main character of our lives, where a lot of us have been shadow artists. A lot of us have lived on the sidelines. I hope we walk away from this book challenging ourselves to do the self-examination, but then let that lead to writing a new narrative for yourself.
As many times as you need to.
Yes.
Right? I think
edit,
edit, revise, reinvent yourself. And I think there's beauty in embracing that unknown. I'm a Capricorn, so I can relate to the internal ways, right? And I just remember wanting to have all of my life planned out. I wanted to know what was next. I wanted to know what was happening, right? And, you know, reflecting on that sort of just intense, unrealistic planning. What a boring life to live if you know everything that is about to happen next. It's so boring, right? So thank you, Chloe, for spending the evening with us. Thank you all for spending the evening with us. And again, just thank you for this beautiful collection, for pouring your heart and soul into it, for picking the right women and the right stories, and just allowing this to be, again, inspirational and aspirational for so many people.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you for, this feels like home, you know? I'm home, and I mean, I don't know who doesn't feel like Busboys is an extension of home. It's like our backyard, but I love to see all the faces that I already love, but all the faces that I hope to fall in love with. But this is, I mean, one of the contributors, Neka Julia, was saying that this book is like soul incarnate. It is an extension of me. So the support of this book it's just beyond everything that I wanted. It's this book represents community, and so anyone who picks up this book and appreciates it without judgment, for any of us, men in the audience as well, you know, that that is a manifestation of the community that I intended for this book to become. So I appreciate you for being here. I love you.
Love you too.
And yeah, thank you.
I'm so proud of you. Let's give her another round of applause.
Okay, everybody, we're gonna open up the floor for a quick Q&A. If you have any questions in the audience. Don't be shy, guys.
Not one.
Did you have a question, Maya? Okay.
What's your question?
What'd you say?
I like the book.
Do you have anybody else?
I have one. Two.
Hi. I'm curious if we'll talk about the process of actually collecting the stories from the women. So, was it dictated to you? Did people write them and send it to you? Or how did you actually do that collection? Was it more of how they wanted to do it, or you had a certain way that you requested?
That's a good question. So I recognize that I've always loved to write. And the podcast was a challenge to myself to get comfortable with speaking. Tonight is a really big challenge. But I feel most comfortable as a writer. But I recognize that not everyone is a writer, but that does not take away from them being a good storyteller, and it does not take away from them having a story qualified to tell. And so while I just offered, however you want to share your story, let me know, and I will receive it. And you can take the first draft. I'll be your editor. You can, just submit your story, and I won't touch it. I want to respect the integrity and the heart that went into it. But if writing is not your thing, tell me your story. Let's drink over a glass of wine. Have a conversation with me virtually, but because this happened in the pandemic. But and so for some of the contributors, we just talked, and I recorded, and then I stripped myself from the transcription, and then I handed it back to them, and I'm like, "This is your story." And a lot of them, they're like, "Wait, I wrote that?" I'm like, "Yes, those are your words. This is your articulation of your story." And for a lot of them, they're like, I'm not a writer. I literally, my brain doesn't work that way. And I'm like, but it does. This is yours. And so I think there's something beautiful when that process. I mean, of course it was beautiful for those of us and those women in here who are writers. But for those who are not and shied away from telling their story for the simple technical fact that they're not innately writers.
Yeah,
And
which
so,
is so funny because storytelling, it's like the oldest form
right,
of communication. It was the way that we shared information. It was,
right,
a lot of times, again, it's rooted in fear.
right.
And so it makes me also think of, the writers and storytellers that you awakened through this process, right?
Yeah.
Because I can imagine someone seeing their story for the first time and being like, oh, you know what, I do got a story to tell.
Right.
That's the way I can write, right?
Yeah, and then to think that, it's how many stories are not being told just because they're not writers, the oral, and that's why I kind of birthed the podcast as well, because the oral storytelling is just as rich. It has almost more texture in some ways. It is not overthinking. It is from the heart. And so I kept, for every woman, whatever their comfortability was, I was like, let me meet you where you are. I'm not expecting you to meet me where I am, but I honor that you have a story worth telling.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have some others?
Ooh, there we go.
Oh, I saw her back there and then her up here.
Hi, this is so wonderful. My question is, so you somehow made the time to put all of this together, and just, we all know that like life, things happen day to day, it's busy, your mom, and all these things. And so what kept you committed to writing amongst all the things that were happening, whether it was COVID, like what brought you back to the project, and like how did you make time to do all the things?
That's a good question. And I don't, had life not, this is the beauty in unintended consequences of pain, is had life not been set up the way it had, I wouldn't have time or like the diligence to do this book. I wrote this book at the tail end of a year that I took off from work. I took a whole year of work off for mental health. And this was literally April 2019 to April 2020. So this was the year before the pandemic. I took a full year off of work, and I committed that, and that was because I needed it, because my anxieties were raging, because my body had let me down, because everything I thought made sense didn't make sense anymore, and that was to the point where it was crippling. And so I spent that year restoring myself, and that was a year I will never forget, never get back, and never be able to repay to my job who gave me permission to take care of myself. And so, the first year I took care of the first year I let myself be drowned in emotion. And I think that is part of the healing process. It is just letting them run through me, acknowledging them, forgiving them, being angry at them, letting them run through me. And then the second part, I took care of my body. At the third part, I started to inch toward socializing a little bit. Gotten to the point of social anxiety and panic attacks in public. And then the third part of that year, I had three months to go before I returned to work, and I was like, I need something tangible. I just the controlling me. I need to show and tell. I need to bigger than that. I need to archive this moment. I need to document it. I need to hold it in my hand as an archive of understanding who I was before this moment. And it felt like the moment to bring the story to life. And just, it started really as I need to tell, I was instructed to take this year off and not return until I'm well. I know my wellness depends on me detoxing some of these stories. And so that was January to March. I hired a book coach and I said, treat this as my full-time job. I have these stories to tell, and I need you to hold me accountable to put them on paper. And that's how I made the time. And then I collected essays from other women after I did my own work, because I couldn't have possibly asked somebody to do what I wasn't willing to do first.
And I love that. Right when you were like, I'm ready to go back to work.
I know.
And then was like,
yes.
man, we're going to give you more time.
Yeah, as soon as the week that I was supposed to go back to work, they were like, nobody's coming back to work. And so I have not been back to the office in over 2.5 years.
Talk about divine alignment. This was supposed, when these things happen, this was supposed to happen right now in this time. You've got the healing that you needed to move forward with this. You got the time and space that you needed to move forward with this.
Yeah.
It's undeniable.
It's interesting because it's not just divine alignment for myself, but it is divine alignment for any Black women who might resonate with this, because now we're all having that year. You know, we've all had that year, not off, but to ourselves. We've all had that year where we are given what the workplace in-person interactions never could, which is like autonomy to have boundaries, you know, autonomy to like take care of our wellness. And, you know, I was in a conversation the other day, and I was like, the divine alignment part of it was that, and then the divine, then on the other hand, you know, George Floyd happened, and then of course Harper Collins is gonna say yes to black voices at that time, you know, and so part of me was like, like I got lucky because they needed it, and then they were like, no, this is meeting that need at that time, and not to boast about it, but it is not just alignment for me, it is alignment for us. And I just feel connected to the timing and the outcome of the book. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Where do we have our next question?
I can just ask and then speak up. Hi. Hi. So you speak so freely about and powerfully about how to tell your story, and you know the power that comes from telling your story. Can you talk about, or just give some advice to people who may feel terrified by the idea of telling their story? What advice would you just give to them?
So advice on or for people who feel terrified about telling their story.
Yeah, because it can be heavy. It can be there's a lot that comes with it, a lot of your identity that's attached to your story. That when you to tell the story, it's like, okay, like how do I do this? So just some advice.
I think that's real, because I think that telling your story out loud runs the risk of re-triggering yourself if it's not well received. Even the exercise of revisiting your story, if there are parts that you haven't in a while, run the risk of not being prepared, you know, for it. And so that question is very valid. I am so hesitant to always give advice, but I do think that, you know, I think that in order to live at a higher vibration, you have to do what you've been scared to do. I really do believe that that leap of faith, whether it's telling your story or doing anything else that is uncomfortable, the familiar will only get you where you've already been. And so if you believe that there's more to your life than you've already seen, you have to do what you've never done. And so I would say that to overcome the fear, which I have experienced heavily, and anxiety, as you know, calling you a lot. But to overcome that fear, we have to, like, it really is rooted in how much do we believe, how much more do we believe this world has for us and God has for us. Because if we believe that our world is what we already know, then why would you why? Like, why are you just doing it to what end? But there's always an end. The end is to live greater, to do greater, like to live in a greater capacity. And you can't exercise that muscle while doing the same things you've done and while staying in a comfort zone. And so for me, I have historically questioned my value and my voice and felt small and felt muted, muffled, silenced. And I can relate to the challenge of why would anyone care? And if no one cares, then why should I do it?
So much self-talk, right?
Right.
I think, and you didn't ask me for my opinion.
I would love to tell you.
So one of the things that has helped me, and you may find it helpful, and some of you may find it helpful, is understanding that fear is biological, right? That it is a part of our genetic makeup that is designed to prevent us from harm, right? So understanding and acknowledging that fear is never going to go away, right? At a certain point, when you want to achieve something, you just have to understand that fear, like we're going along for the ride together, right? Like I move forward with fear, not in fear, but with fear, right? Fear is not going anywhere, right? Because it's the same thing when we're walking across a crosswalk and we see a car speeding. That fear that we're about to get hit by the car, that's the same thing that, how am I going to move forward with this? What if, right? But the same way, if you don't pause, maybe let the car go, whatever it is, right? And keep going across, it's the same. You have to move forward with fear. Not in fear, with fear.
That's a good one. And I will say that, like, I'm still terrified. Like,
Yeah,
so it makes me
never going anywhere.
Yeah, and so even like the decision to write this book, what I was scared of, I hadn't yet gotten to the, I had got, right at the point, at that time, I was like, I'm gonna self-publish. It's all, I'm gonna publish just a batch, probably this many books. But my fear, I think fear evolves too. So at the time of committing to the book, my fear was, what if I ask myself these tough questions and what am I going to find out? My fear is what am I going to find out about myself? About when I look back at the young woman I used to be and how I processed that or how I reacted to those. My fear was like the discovery that I would find out about myself. Then at the second process, my fear is of rejection. If the publisher says it's no good and they don't want it, then maybe that just affirm is not the right word, but what if that just validates my self-doubt and then I'll just crawl back into the hole. And then the fear of when I had the last opportunity to make edits to my stories.
Sorry, that's like the author's.
Yes.
Yeah, that is fear.
And yes,
Yeah.
this was last December. I was like trembling with fear because you mean I am putting my heart on the, and I can't edit this ever again.
Yeah.
Like this is it. This is how people are going to interpret it as they will, as they want.
Yeah, you know it's wild. That doesn't go away.
And it doesn't
I've written
go away.
over 3 dozen books, and every single time there's that fear. Every single time there are nightmares before the book is released, right? Like I'll have.
Right.
Did you have nightmares? It's like,
Yes,
it's like a thing.
leading up to the release, there's the other fear.
It's a thing.
And then my fear now is a lot of people have received the book and it's been well received, but a lot of people haven't actually read it yet. So once there's like the second wave of people actually reading it and they're not actually asking me questions about the book itself. Oh my God. So there's like always this like your fear is evolving around different things, and
So
so
you move forward. You move forward each step, right? Each step of each fear as it evolved, shaped, transitioned. You moved right along with it for this book to happen.
Yeah. I mean, and even Adia, I remember about maybe like literally like 3 weeks before the book release date, I was like, can I tell Harper never mind?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to do this anymore. This is too uncomfortable. But now that it's out, now I have something else to be afraid of. But I can look back at what I was afraid of, and now I'm like, this is love.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, we're gonna have 1 or 2 more questions. If you have any questions?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Christine and Chloe, for this evening. It's been great. My question is more so about if you could speak to letting go in that process and actually releasing and then walking into the new chapter, which is accepting and believing that you're worthy of receiving what it is that you wanted, and kind of letting go of the connection to the past trauma, and just letting that go, and being like, you know what, I am where I'm supposed to be, this is what I deserve, and I don't want that to kind of dictate my steps anymore, and feeling worthy of the goodness that is actually coming.
I would say I still struggle with that. As you know, looking at the table that knows me well, I definitely still struggle with that. I think it does, echo what you, Christine, said around the release, how transformative it can be. But I also often reference when I look at, releasing the past, or releasing toxic attachments to people or ideas or perceptions, expectations, all those things. I often said you can't, two things. You can't take dead things into new spaces, and you can't water rotten seeds. And a lot of us are watering rotten seeds. And to me, what that means is investing in things that are just not growing, And think of our well, if we have a cup, it's our currency, it's our energy. And to pour that into something that is clearly just not growing. And those could represent poor narratives of ourselves. It could represent, experiences in our past that have too tight of a grasp, that they suffocate us and we're not able to breathe new life into ourselves. And so for me, it's about, what are you going to do with your water? How are you going to treat it? What are you going to let bloom? If you really, the only way to get to a blossom is to harvest, and you can't harvest rotten seeds. And so for me, I just root in that. I think that came up with that quote when one of those wine-filled nights. I'm like, yeah, rotten seeds, right? But that's my. I think everything in metaphors and so.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Everyone have a question?
Was there an essay that you wrote that kind of brought you to your knees? And if so, which one was it?
To my knees. I think they all. I can't think of one that didn't. Because I felt that the experience of fleshing through these stories were all personally, emotionally, spiritually revelatory. I think the one that the two that resonated with, in terms of that question, the ones that jolted me the most were A Pierced Memory Imagined, because that felt like the oldest pain point in my life that I hadn't resolved, and Cradled by the Sun, which was the most recent. And the Cradled by the Sun, my son, Elle, would call my son, Molly, that is no longer here, the sun. And so I think in the season that I was writing this book, I was writing from a place of pain. And those are my two deepest pain points. But it's interesting, back to the question around, we were talking about, re-editing our stories, that when I put the first drafts on paper that I was writing from a place of pain for a lot of these stories. But a year later, when I had a chance to revise and edit them for the last time, I'm like, look at me growing and shit. Like the last year between, drafting and editing, I had done so much. I had just done a lot of work and a lot of clarity came. And so when I returned to the pages, I wasn't editing from a place of pain, but I was looking back at myself from a year prior, almost in conversation with myself, and I was able to see through my words that, oh, I see what this is. It was like, I see what you did here. And so I got to edit my perspective on some of these like bigger pain points and edit them from a place of more resolve, from a place of more peace, from a place of forgiveness and, just like holding my hands with myself, it felt like. It was a very like, okay, I'm writing about myself in my teenage years and here's my relationship with her now. I'm writing about myself in my early 20s. It was an assessment of my relationship with her now, even a year prior. And I think it's beautiful when we're able to look back and see when we are not addressing our pain points front and center, when we are going around them, we are in denial, when we are, leaning on perfectionism or escapism to avoid the tough work. That's only I found that I personally was getting in these cycles. When I stopped the cycles, the growth, it happens, the rate at which I was growing was so much faster than before I committed to myself. And I think that is the beauty, and we can, now I can, while it was terrifying writing these stories, now I can tell the stories just a lot lighter, right? So.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. And let's give these guys another round of applause. So we're going to have some book sales over here and some signings for anybody who would like to get a copy. To everybody on the live stream, I'd like to let you know that you can purchase a copy on the Eventbrite link up until 10 p.m. today. So, all right. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so